Think about the last wedding you attended. The white dress, the rings, the vows. That moment when someone asks if anyone objects. You probably thought those traditions were modern inventions. They're not. Almost every single one of them comes from the Middle Ages, and the original versions were far stranger than anything you'd see today. Here is what might surprise you. In medieval Europe, you didn't actually need a church to get married. You didn't need a priest. You didn't even need witnesses. Two people could exchange vows behind a haystack, consummate the relationship, and the church considered them legally married. That simplicity created absolute chaos for centuries. If you are settling in for the night, perfect. These stories have waited 700 years. They'll still be here when you wake up. Subscribe and stick around. Tonight we're going to pull back the curtain on medieval marriage. Not the fairy tale version with knights and princesses, but the real thing. The business deals disguised as romance. The bedroom rituals witnessed by crowds. The rules about when you could and couldn't be intimate with your own spouse. And the surprising moments where genuine love broke through anyway. Let's start with something fundamental. If you were born into a noble family in the 12th century, your marriage was not your decision. It wasn't even really about you. Marriage among the aristocracy was a business transaction, a political alliance, a transfer of land and power between families. Your feelings about your future spouse were about as relevant as the feelings of the castle furniture. The negotiations could begin when you were still a child. Girls could be betrothed as young as 7 years old. The church set the minimum age of consent at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But even those ages feel impossibly young to us now. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII of England, was married at just 12 years old. The arrangement worked like this. The bride's family would provide a dowry, a payment of money, land, or goods to the groom's family. In return, the groom's family would provide something called a dower, a portion of their estate set aside for the bride's financial security if her husband died. These negotiations could drag on for months, sometimes years. The actual feelings of the two people getting married barely entered the conversation. The dowry itself could make or break a family. For wealthy households, it might include estates, chests of silver, herds of livestock, or bolts of expensive fabric. For poorer families, it might be a few cooking pots, some linens, and a modest sum of coins. But regardless of scale, the dowry was non-negotiable. A father who couldn't provide an adequate dowry might find his daughter unmarriageable. And a daughter without marriage prospects was a financial burden that many medieval families struggled to bear. Some families went into devastating debt to fund their daughters' dowries. Others simply couldn't manage it and sent their daughters to convents. Instead, becoming a nun wasn't always a spiritual calling. Sometimes it was what happened when your family couldn't afford to marry you off. The entrance fee to a convent was typically much lower than a marriage dowry. A family's inability to marry their daughters wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a social catastrophe, and here is the thing. This wasn't some cruel system designed to make people miserable. From a medieval perspective, it made perfect sense. In a world without banks, without insurance, without social safety nets, marriage was the primary mechanism for building economic security and political stability. A good marriage could elevate an entire family for generations. A bad one could destroy them. But what about ordinary people, peasants and commoners? Here is where the picture gets more complicated and, honestly, more interesting. Among the lower classes, people actually did marry for love, at least more often than the nobles did. When you don't have vast estates or political alliances to worry about, the stakes of choosing your own partner drop considerably. Peasant women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, and their husbands were usually just a few years older. The ceremony might be as simple as exchanging vows in front of family and friends, maybe at the local tavern, maybe at a neighbor's house. Records show that couples married on roads, in fields, at friends' homes, and even in bed. Anywhere two people could say the words counted. Research from the University of Cambridge suggests that medieval demographic patterns were much more like modern ones than previously thought. In England after the Black Death, studies of the 1377 poll tax found that around 60% of women were married, roughly the same proportion as in the 17th century. Between 15 and 20% of women never married at all. The idea that everyone in the Middle Ages married young and had enormous families turns out to be largely a myth. Now, the Church had opinions about all of this. Lots of opinions by the 12th century. Marriage had been declared a sacrament, a sacred and legally binding union blessed by God. The Church wanted marriages to be public, to be witnessed, and to be performed with proper ceremony. But enforcing that was another matter entirely. Here is something most people don't realize. Medieval wedding ceremonies didn't take place inside the church. They happened outside, at the church door. The couple would stand before the entrance, exchange their vows with a priest officiating, and only then would everyone move inside for a special mass. The bride stood on the groom's left side, a tradition based on the belief that Eve was created from Adam's left rib. But there was another reason for that positioning. The groom's right hand, his fighting hand, needed to be free, just in case someone showed up to object and tried to steal the bride. That sounds absurd to us now. It was a genuine concern in the 13th century, and that tradition of asking whether anyone objects to the marriage, that comes directly from the medieval practice of publishing the bans. The bans were public announcements posted on the church door or read aloud during 3 consecutive Sunday services before the wedding. They stated who was getting married and invited anyone with a legitimate reason to prevent the union to come forward. Maybe the groom was already married. Maybe the couple was too closely related. Maybe one of them had taken religious. The bans gave the community time to raise these concerns before it was too late. And the rules about who could marry whom were extraordinarily strict. Before 1215, the year of the Fourth Lateran Council, anyone who shared a common ancestor, going back 7 generations, was prohibited from marrying. Think about that for a moment. 7 generations in a small medieval village where families had lived for centuries. That rule could eliminate almost every potential spouse in your community. The Fourth Lateran Council recognized this was unworkable and reduced the prohibition to 4 generations. If you didn't share a great-great-grandparent, you were in the clear. It sounds simple, but in practice, tracking genealogies back 4 generations in an era without birth certificates was its own kind of nightmare, and powerful families sometimes exploited this confusion, suddenly discovering a previously unknown family connection when they wanted to escape an inconvenient marriage. Now let's talk about the wedding itself. After the ceremony at the church door, the real celebration began, the wedding feast. For nobility, this could last for days, tables groaning with roasted meats, pies, and sweetmeats, musicians playing, wine flowing freely. The scale of the feast was a direct reflection of the family's wealth and status. A modest celebration could be seen as an insult. And here is something that might surprise you about the bride's appearance. She didn't wear white. The white wedding dress didn't become tradition until Queen Victoria wore one in 1840. Medieval brides wore their best dress, whatever color it happened to be. Green was the color of love, blue was the color of purity, red signified fertility and passion. A wealthy bride might commission a new gown for the occasion, but there was no expectation of a specific color. The bride's clothing was actually considered lucky, which led to one of the more chaotic wedding traditions. At the end of the celebration, guests would chase the bride trying to grab scraps of her clothing for good luck. Imagine a medieval woman in her finest dress being pursued by a crowd of tipsy wedding guests, all trying to tear off a piece of fabric. The tradition of the garter toss may have originated as a way to give guests something to grab without destroying the bride's entire outfit. But here is something you might not expect. The wedding cake as we know it didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Instead, guests would bring small cakes or buns and stack them in a pile between the bride and groom. The couple would try to kiss over the top of the pile without knocking it over. If they succeeded, it was supposed to guarantee a prosperous life together. Some historians believe this is where the tradition of the tiered wedding cake eventually came from. And then came the part of the evening that would horrify any modern couple. The bedding ceremony after the feast, the newlyweds were escorted to their bedroom by a crowd of family, friends, and guests. A priest would bless the bed. The couple would be given cups of sweetened, spiced wine, and then things got strange. The bridesmaids and groomsmen would sit on either side of the bed and throw the couple's stockings at them. According to superstition, whoever managed a direct hit would be the next person to get married. Then finally, the curtains would be drawn around the bed and the guests would leave. In most of Western Europe, the actual consummation was private, but the ritual of getting there was anything but. In parts of Germany, the bedding ceremony was accompanied by the sound of pipes, drums, and what contemporary sources diplomatically described as obscene noises from the guests gathered outside. The idea was to celebrate loudly enough that the newlyweds couldn't be heard. In Scandinavian traditions, the most distinguished wedding guest had the honor of leading the bride to the bed in a formal procession. After tucking the couple in, guests would offer dishes of food, eat quickly alongside them, and then leave them alone. The bed itself mattered enormously. Specially decorated wedding beds were sometimes borrowed from friends, family, or neighbors, because the quality of the bed reflected the importance of the union. Some families invested more in the wedding bed than in the feast itself. The bed wasn't just furniture, it was the stage where the marriage became real. For royal marriages, the stakes were even higher. Consummation wasn't just a personal matter, it was a political one. Without consummation, a marriage could be annulled, alliances could crumble, and claims to inheritance could be challenged. In some royal households, witnesses remained nearby during the wedding night. not necessarily watching, but close enough to testify that the marriage had been completed. In some traditions, the bedsheets were inspected the next morning for evidence of the bride's virginity. The stained sheet might be displayed publicly, hung from a window or carried through the streets. This wasn't universal across medieval Europe, but it happened frequently enough that it shaped how people thought about marriage, honor, and the human body for centuries. There was another mourning tradition that gets less attention, but tells us something important about how medieval people thought about marriage. The mourning gift in Germanic and Scandinavian traditions, the groom would present his new bride with a gift the morning after the wedding night. This wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a legal transaction. The mourning gift formally acknowledged the consummation of the marriage, and it became the bride's personal property. In Old Swedish law, a woman whose husband died was entitled to a third of his estate as inheritance, but only if the marriage had been properly consummated and the mourning gift had been given. Think about what that means. The mourning gift turned an intimate act into a legal marker. It was simultaneously private and deeply public, personal and profoundly economic. That tension between love and law runs through every aspect of medieval marriage, like a thread you can't quite pull free. If you are drifting off right now, that is completely fine. Let the stories carry you. We're just getting started on some of the strangest parts. Let's talk about what happened after the wedding. Because the church didn't just have rules about who you could marry and how. It had remarkably specific rules about what married couples could do in the privacy of their own bedroom, and when they could do it and how. The level of intrusion into married life would be almost unimaginable today. According to church teachings in the early Middle Ages, married couples were forbidden from being intimate on Sundays, Thursdays, and Fridays. They also had to abstain during the 6 weeks of Lent, during Advent before Christmas, on all major feast days, on all fast days, and on the days honoring various saints. Add it up, and the average medieval couple could legally be intimate less than once per week. But the restrictions went even further. Intimacy was forbidden during pregnancy, during menstruation, while the wife was breastfeeding, and for 40 days after childbirth. The church taught that the only acceptable purpose of marital relations was procreation. Pleasure was a sinful side effect to be tolerated, not pursued, and the only approved method was what later generations would call the missionary position. Anything else was considered sinful and could require years of penance. Now, did people actually follow these rules? Almost certainly not. Most historians agree that the Church's sexual regulations were more aspirational than practical. By the 12th century, even many clergy acknowledged that these restrictions were unrealistic and softened their stance to something more like guidelines. But the rules existed, they were taught, and they shaped how people thought about intimacy, guilt, and the body for generations. Confessors, the priests who heard people's sins, were given detailed manuals instructing them to ask married couples very specific questions about their intimate lives. The questions covered every conceivable variation of the sexual act. The confessional became a place where the most private aspects of married life were laid bare before a representative of the church. The irony of a celibate priest interrogating a married couple about bedroom specifics was apparently lost on no one, but the practice continued for centuries, and there were consequences for breaking the rules. The penitentials, handbooks that prescribed punishments for various sins, laid out specific penances for sexual transgressions within marriage. Having relations on a forbidden day might require days of fasting. Using an unapproved method could mean years of penance. The punishments seem absurdly harsh to modern eyes, but they reveal just how seriously the Church took its role as guardian of married intimacy. Here is where it gets really interesting, though. Despite all these restrictions, medieval marriage law included one concept that was surprisingly progressive. The marital debt. Both husbands and wives had the right to demand intimacy from their spouse, and both had the obligation to comply. In a world that overwhelmingly favored men in almost every other legal and social sphere, this was one area where women had recognized enforceable rights, and women used those rights. If a wife believed her husband was incapable of fulfilling his marital obligations, she could petition the church courts for an annulment on grounds of impotence. These cases actually went to trial, and the trials were extraordinarily invasive by any standard, medieval or modern. In a typical impotence trial, a jury of matrons, older women deemed respectable enough to serve as expert witnesses, would be assembled. Their job was to physically examine the husband and determine whether he was capable of consummation. A case from York in 1370 described a husband whose anatomy was examined by 3 matrons who provided detailed clinical testimony to the court. The records are startlingly specific. If the husband was found incapable, the marriage would be annulled. The wife was free to marry again. For men, these trials were public humiliation on an almost unimaginable scale. But for women trapped in loveless or non-consummated marriages, impotence trials were one of the very few legal escape routes available in an era when divorce essentially didn't exist. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval marriage: the question of divorce. In the modern sense of the word, divorce didn't exist in medieval Europe. The Church taught that marriage was an unbreakable bond created by God. What man has joined together, let no man put asunder. Once you were married for life, period. But there were loopholes. The Church recognized 2 ways a marriage could end. The first was annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Grounds for annulment included consanguinity, meaning the couple was too closely related, or that one spouse had been unable to consent, perhaps because they were underage or coerced, or that the marriage hadn't been consummated, or that one spouse had previously made religious vows. The second option was legal separation, known as divorce from bed and board. This allowed a couple to live apart, usually on grounds of cruelty or adultery, but neither spouse could remarry while the other was alive. It was a half measure at best. You could escape a miserable marriage, but you were stuck in a kind of marital limbo for the rest of your days. Historians studying English court records have discovered something unexpectedly familiar. There was an annual spike in annulment and separation cases right after Christmas, dating back to at least the 14th century. Apparently, spending the holiday season trapped in close quarters with an unhappy spouse is not a uniquely modern phenomenon. 700 years later, divorce lawyers still report their busiest season in January. Powerful families quickly learned to exploit the annulment system. The consanguinity rules were especially useful. If a noble wanted out of a political marriage that was no longer advantageous, he could hire genealogists to dig through family trees until they found some distant shared ancestor. Suddenly, a marriage that had lasted 20 years and produced multiple children could be declared invalid because the couple's great-great-grandmothers were second cousins. Not every medieval culture followed the same rules, though. In Ireland, marriage law was strikingly different from the rest of Europe. Under the Brehon laws, Irish women had far more rights than their continental counterparts. A woman could divorce her husband for failing to provide for the family, for physical abuse, for impotence, and even for spreading malicious gossip about her after their divorce. A man could divorce his wife too, but the grounds were symmetrical. Both parties had genuine legal standing. In 1074, the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote to the Irish kings describing their marriage practices as abominable exchanges. What he found abominable, of course, was the fact that Irish marriages could be dissolved. For the continental church, that was heresy. For Irish women, it was freedom. Eleanor of Aquitaine is perhaps the most famous example. She married King Louis VII of France in 1137, after 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters. The union was annulled in 1152 on grounds of consanguinity. Within 8 weeks, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would become King Henry II of England. The consanguinity that supposedly prevented her first marriage didn't seem to trouble anyone the second time around. Eleanor's story reveals the cynicism at the heart of aristocratic marriage. Her first marriage had been a strategic alliance. When it stopped being politically useful, the rules were bent until it broke. Her second marriage was equally strategic, but it also produced one of the most dramatic royal partnerships in medieval history. 8 children, rebellion, imprisonment. Eleanor eventually outlived Henry and wielded enormous political power into her 70s. She died in 1204 at the extraordinary age of around 82. The woman who had been traded between kings as a political asset became one of the most formidable rulers of her age. But here is the thing. While the powerful played chess with marriage laws, something unexpected was happening in the wider culture. The concept of romantic love was being invented, or at least reinvented, and it had almost nothing to do with marriage. In the courts of southern France during the 12th century, poets called troubadours began singing about something they called courtly love. These weren't love songs about married couples. They were songs about a knight's devotion to an unattainable lady, usually someone else's wife. The love was supposed to be pure, ennobling, and ultimately unconsummated. The knight would wear his lady's favor, a handkerchief or personal token, and perform heroic deeds in her name. Think about that for a second. The most celebrated love stories of the Middle Ages were specifically about love outside of marriage. Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde. These tales captivated medieval audiences precisely because they depicted a kind of passionate devotion that arranged marriages rarely provided. The implication was hard to miss. True love and marriage were separate things, sometimes even incompatible. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 1300s, composed a poem called The Parliament of Fowls that linked St. Valentine's Day to romantic love for the first time. He described it as the day when birds choose their mates. The idea caught fire. Within a century, people across England were calling their sweethearts their Valentines. A tradition that began in a medieval poet's imagination became one of the most enduring cultural rituals in the Western world. The irony is almost painful. A civilization that made marriage the foundation of social order also produced a literary tradition that celebrated love as something that existed best outside those boundaries. It tells you something about the gap between how medieval people were told to live and how they actually felt. And yet, real love did exist within medieval marriages. We know this because some of it survived in letters. The Paston family of Norfolk, England, left behind a collection of correspondence spanning most of the 15th century, and buried within those letters are moments of genuine tenderness that bridge 7 centuries as easily as a heartbeat. In February of 1477, a young woman named Marjorie Brews wrote to her intended husband John Paston, calling him her right well-beloved Valentine. It is believed to be the oldest surviving Valentine's letter in the English language. Their families were arguing over money. Her father wanted John to be wealthier. John's brother thought her dowry was too small. But Marjorie wrote to John with raw, unmistakable affection. She told him that even if he had only half his current wealth, she wouldn't forsake him. She would do the greatest labor any woman alive might do just to be with him. They eventually married despite the financial disputes. And years later, Marjorie was still writing to her husband, addressing him as my own sweetheart, and telling him she thought of him day and night. But not every love story ended so well. In the same Paston family, John's younger sister, also named Marjorie, fell in love with the family's bailiff, Richard Calley. A bailiff was a servant. His family sold mustard and candles in a market town. For the socially ambitious Pastons, this was catastrophic. Marjorie's brother furiously wrote that their parents would never consent to having their sister sell candles and mustard. But Marjorie and Richard had secretly exchanged vows. Under church law, those private vows, witnessed only by God, were as binding as any ceremony performed at a cathedral door. The Paston family tried to have the marriage overturned. They sent Marjorie to live elsewhere. They intercepted Richard's letters, but when the local bishop examined Marjorie, she refused to deny the vows. The marriage stood, and it lasted. Stories like these remind us that medieval people were not so different from us. They loved, they yearned, they sometimes chose their hearts over their family's plans, knowing the cost would be enormous. The system was rigid, but the human heart has never been very good at following rules. If you are still with me, let's go deeper into some of the strangest corners of medieval marriage. Because there are aspects of this institution that seem almost impossible to believe, even by the standards of everything we've already covered. Love potions. They were everywhere in medieval culture. Manuals circulated with recipes for concoctions that could supposedly make someone fall in love with you. The ingredients ranged from relatively harmless herbs like rue and myrrh to genuinely disturbing components: menstrual blood, semen, ground up animal organs. Most of these potions were based on symbolic associations rather than any actual pharmacological effect. but people believed in them deeply. The Church officially condemned love magic as sorcery, but its persistence suggests that many medieval people felt powerless in their romantic lives and were willing to try anything. When your marriage has been arranged by parents you might never see again, and your new spouse is a complete stranger, the idea that a potion might spark some genuine affection must have been desperately appealing. The Church also recognized a peculiar category that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else: the spiritual marriage. Some deeply devout couples chose to marry but agreed to never consummate the union, living together as brother and sister in what they considered a higher form of devotion. The Church celebrated these arrangements as the ultimate triumph of spiritual purity over carnal desire. For everyone else, they must have seemed baffling. And then there were arrangements that didn't fit any official category at all. In late medieval France, legal contracts called affaires-firements allowed two unrelated men to formalize a domestic partnership. They pledged to live together, sharing one bread, one wine, and one purse, meaning all property became joint, whether these relationships were romantic, practical, or both. The community accepted them. They existed in a gray area that the Church's rigid marriage framework simply couldn't accommodate. Now here is something that challenges almost everything we think we know about the Middle Ages. Widows, in a world that generally treated women as property to be transferred between fathers and husbands, widows occupied a uniquely powerful position. When a husband died, his widow often inherited control of his land and business. She became a property owner in her own right, and she became an extremely attractive target for ambitious younger men. Medieval court records are full of cases involving wealthy widows being pressured, courted, and sometimes outright coerced into new marriages. Some widows resisted fiercely, preferring their independence to another union. Others remarried quickly, sometimes choosing their own husbands for the first time in their lives. The widow was one of the few medieval women who had genuine agency in her romantic life, and some of them used it. And then there is the question of consent. This is where medieval marriage gets genuinely complicated. Church doctrine was clear. Both the bride and groom had to consent to the marriage for it to be valid. This was not optional, it was the law. Even Pope Alexander III, in the late 1100s, declared that mutual consent was the only essential element of a valid marriage. Not a ceremony, not a priest, not witnesses, just two people saying yes, but the gap between law and reality was enormous. Social and family pressure could be overwhelming. A daughter who refused to marry the man her father had chosen might be beaten, confined, or cut off from her family entirely. The Church said consent mattered, but the Church also said children should honor their parents. When those two principles collided, parents usually won. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because we have court records from medieval ecclesiastical courts that show women fighting back. Women who claimed their marriages were invalid because their consent had been coerced. Women who petitioned for annulments on grounds of violence or cruelty. Women who risked their family's wrath and their own social standing to argue that they had been forced into unions against their will. The outcomes varied. Some won their freedom. Many didn't. But the fact that they tried tells us something important about the women who lived in this era. They weren't passive objects being moved around on a chessboard. They understood their rights. They knew the law. And when those rights were violated, some of them fought like hell. Think about that for a second. 7 centuries ago, in a world that barely acknowledged women as legal persons, women were standing up in courts and demanding that their consent be recognized. The courage that required is staggering. Let's shift to something that connects medieval marriage to our world in a way you might not expect. The concept of the clandestine marriage. Remember that 2 people could create a valid marriage just by exchanging vows in private? No witnesses needed, no priest needed, just words and intention. This caused enormous legal headaches. Imagine a scenario where a man exchanges private vows with a woman, consummates the relationship, and then denies the marriage ever happened. She says they're married. He says they're not. There are no witnesses. Who does the court believe? These cases clogged ecclesiastical courts for centuries. The confusion they caused is a major reason the Church eventually pushed for public ceremonies and official witnesses. The Council of Trent in the 16th century finally required Catholic marriages to be performed by a priest before witnesses and properly recorded. But throughout the medieval period, the validity of private, unwitnessed marriages remained a source of legal chaos and real human suffering. Now, we've talked about the rules, the ceremonies, the legal structures, but what was daily married life actually like for ordinary people in the Middle Ages? What did it feel like to be married in the 14th century? For most people, it was a partnership of survival. Husband and wife worked together to maintain the household. In peasant families, both partners performed essential labor. The husband might plow, plant, and harvest. The wife would manage the household, tend livestock, brew ale, make bread, preserve food, spin wool, and raise the children. Neither could easily survive without the other. Privacy was almost non-existent. In humble households, the entire family slept in a single room. The bed, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, might be shared with children, relatives, or even servants. In wealthier homes, servants typically slept in the same room as their masters. The idea of a bedroom as a private retreat for a married couple was largely unknown. This lack of privacy meant that much of married life happened in public. Arguments were heard by the whole household. Intimacy was something you managed around the presence of others, and the community's opinion of your marriage mattered enormously. Neighbors watched, neighbors gossiped, neighbors testified in court if things went wrong. In medieval villages, marriage was never purely a private matter. The community considered itself a stakeholder in every union, and yet somehow, despite the lack of privacy, despite the Church's endless restrictions, despite the economic pressures and the arranged unions, medieval married people managed to build lives together. Court records and personal letters reveal moments of genuine partnership, affection, and even humor between spouses. A popular saying of the time, often attributed to Saint Jerome, quipped that marriage is good for those who are afraid to sleep alone at night. There is something deeply human about that. Even in a civilization that treated marriage primarily as an economic institution, people found ways to make it personal, to make it theirs. Let's talk about what happened when marriages ended the way most medieval marriages did. Not through annulment or separation, but through death. In an era of plague, warfare, and childbirth mortality, losing a spouse was devastatingly common. Average life expectancy hovered somewhere in the low 30s, though that number is misleading. If you survive childhood, you might live to 60 or beyond. But the risks were constant. Women faced the specific danger of death in childbirth. Without modern medicine, every pregnancy was a gamble. A man might outlive 2 or 3 wives, but men also died young, from war, from accidents, from disease. The result was a society where remarriage was common and families were frequently blended. A household might include children from 3 or 4 different marriages, and when a spouse died, the practical consequences were immediate. A woman who lost her husband might lose her home, her income, and her social standing overnight. The dower, that portion of her husband's estate set aside for her, was supposed to provide protection, but enforcing dower rights often required legal battles that could drag on for years. The Paston letters are full of Margaret Paston fighting to secure properties that were rightfully hers after her husband's death. For men, losing a wife meant losing the person who managed the household, raised the children, and kept the domestic economy running. Remarriage was often a practical necessity as much as an emotional choice. The speed with which some medieval men remarried after being widowed was remarkable. Sometimes within weeks of their wife's death. And here is the thing. Amid all the economic calculations and social pressures and church regulations, there are these small, startling moments where the genuine grief of losing a loved one cuts through the centuries like a blade. Tomb inscriptions that speak of beloved wives, letters from husbands expressing inconsolable loss, wills that include heartbreakingly specific bequests to surviving spouses. My best bed, my silver cup, the ring she always wore. These aren't the artifacts of cold, loveless unions. They're the fingerprints of genuine human connection, preserved across 700 years in stone and ink and fading parchment. We sometimes look back at the Middle Ages and see barbarity, cruelty, ignorance, and some of that was certainly there. But when it came to marriage, what we also see is people doing the best they could within a system they didn't choose. Families trying to secure their children's futures, couples trying to build partnership from arrangement, individuals fighting for the right to. The traditions they created didn't die with them. That ring on the 4th finger, the vows exchanged before witnesses, the question of whether anyone objects the feast that follows the ceremony. The customs we follow today at weddings are medieval inventions shaped by the concerns and beliefs of people who lived and loved and struggled centuries before us. And maybe the most important thing they left us is the idea that a marriage should be based on consent, that both people should say yes. It seems obvious now. But in the 12th century, when the Church insisted that mutual consent was the foundation of a valid marriage, it was revolutionary. It planted a seed that took centuries to fully grow, but its roots are there, in those medieval church courts where women stood up and said, "I did not consent." So the next time you are at a wedding and you hear those familiar words, does anyone here present know of any reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage? Remember where that comes from. It comes from notices pinned to church doors in 1300. It comes from a world where marriage was property and politics and survival. And yet, somehow, it was also love. Marjorie Bruce called John Paston her well-beloved Valentine in 1477. Nearly 550 years later, we still call the people we love our Valentines. Some things, it turns out, are genuinely timeless. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your evening with these stories. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way, that is exactly what this was for. Either way, subscribe and stick around. There are always more mysteries waiting. Good night. Sleep well. And when you wake up, maybe look at the traditions you take for granted with a little more wonder. They've traveled a very long way to reach you.